All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at some highly provocative source material that completely shifts how we might look at ancient Asian geography. Have you ever thought that the borders of the ancient world might be, well, completely different from what we've been taught? We are unpacking a fascinating set of records that challenges the traditional narrative of the ancient Korean kingdom of Baekje. We're going to explore a theory presented in these sources suggesting Baekje wasn't just confined to the Korean peninsula, but actually held a massive continental empire. Just take a look at what the source material is presenting here. It totally defies what mainstream history tells us about the borders of ancient Baekje. Instead of just sitting down in the southwestern corner of the Korean peninsula, this outlines a massive territory pushing way deep into the Chinese mainland. The source we're analyzing today argues passionately that this isn't just alternate history or fantasy, but the actual, documented reality hidden right within official ancient historical texts. So the big question we're investigating today based on this source is the author's really radical claim. Did Baekje actually possess a sprawling empire far beyond what modern textbooks say? The source insists that if we look closely at the official dynastic histories of China, which are the primary records written by the very dynasties Baekje allegedly conquered, we will find undeniable proof of a continental Baekje. To map out this argument, here is what we'll cover in this explainer. First, the emergence of continental Baekje. Second, the Yoseo and Jinpyang records in the Songso. Third, King Dongsung and his 7 administrators. Fourth, an intentional deletion in the Namjiso. And finally, the modern-day clash over the modern Samgaksa. Okay, starting with part 1, the emergence of continental Baekje, and this whole paradigm-shifting theory. The author strictly relies on China's 25 histories, which are basically the canonical official historical records, to visualize this claim. They make the point that if we deny these official texts, we might as well just give up on studying history altogether. Notice how the fertile eastern plains of China are shown here as the domain of ancient Korean states. The source notes that historically, Chinese dynasties often position their capitals inland, in rugged, mountainous regions like Shanxi province. According to the author, these inland dynasties look toward the lush, wealthy eastern seaboard, a region they claim was actually governed by the Dongyi, or eastern peoples, which included Baekje. Moving to part 2, examining the primary evidence, specifically the Yoseo and Jinpyang records in the Songso. Looking directly at the Book of Song, or Songso, which is the 6th book in those 25 histories and a heavily relied upon primary source, the author zeroes in on this exact passage. They use it to argue that as early as the 3rd century, Baekje had officially occupied 2 very specific mainland Chinese territories. The text literally states that while Goguryeo took the Liaodong region, Baekje expanded and seized the commanderies of Yoso and Jinpyong. The author stresses that this isn't some vague reference. The Chinese records acknowledge losing their own territory to Baekje and note that Baekje set up its own administration right there on the mainland. And here are the geographical anchors for that claim. The ancient texts explicitly place these commanderies between Yuseong and Bukpyong. To put that into modern terms, Bukpyong is essentially modern-day Beijing, and Yuseong is situated just south of there, near the Yellow River. That puts Baekje's administration squarely inside the heart of mainland China's eastern territory. The author asks a really pointed question here. If the victims, the Chinese dynasties themselves, recorded that Baekje took their land, why do modern historians ignore it? All right, part 3, King Dongsung and his 7 administrators governing the coast. The author claims this mainland expansion actually hit its peak during the 31-year reign of Baekje's King Dongsung. And interestingly, this perfectly overlaps with the 31-year existence of China's Southern Qi dynasty. Drawing from the Book of Southern Qi, or Namjiso, the source argues that King Dongsung sent a state letter to the Southern Qi emperor. In this letter, he assigned specific Baekje generals as administrators, or Teisu, over Chinese coastal regions. So the key takeaway is that we have records of specific Baekje generals with traditional Baekje surnames being granted jurisdiction over specific mainland Chinese territories, like Guangyang, Changha, and Guangyang. You can see on this map how the author builds this narrative. The red circles highlight the mainland territories assigned to the 7 Baekje administrators, essentially suggesting Baekje governed the Chinese eastern seaboard all the way from Beijing down to Shanghai. The source views this not just as a temporary military raid, but as an established structured continental administration by Baekje over the absolute most fertile lands in East Asia. Which brings us to part 4, the intentional deletion in the Namjiso, or the suppressed history. Now you're probably wondering, if these incredible records actually exist in the official Chinese histories, why aren't they just part of the mainstream consensus today? Well, the source explains that ancient Chinese historians operated under a strict historiographical rule of concealing national humiliation. Basically, they would deliberately alter texts, talk up China, and downplay foreign nations rather than admit a kingdom like Baekje dominated their land. The author argues that Chinese scribes altered the wording of King Dongsong's letter to make it sound like Baekje was subserviently asking for permission rather than asserting its own imperial dominance. But it actually gets way more dramatic than just tweaked wording. The author points to some startling physical evidence found right inside the Book of Southern Qi. Look at this. There is a huge, undeniable gap in the ancient text. Literally just blank space right where the glorious records of King Dongsing's continental achievements supposedly were. The author theorizes that later historians simply could not stomach the humiliation of Baekje's dominance and practically ripped the records right out. Check out these specific characters found right after that blank space. In comparative versions from 1637, 1739, and 1874, the text explicitly reads missing text below. For the author, this is basically the smoking gun. They view this as absolute proof of an intentional cover-up by later dynasties to wipe the legacy of Continental Baekje completely off the map. And finally, Part 5, Modern Samgaksa and Flunkyism, which dives into the ideological clash happening today. So why do modern Korean historians allegedly ignore this evidence? The source points a finger at mainstream academia, accusing them of suffering from sadaejui, which translates to flunkyism. It's essentially a subservient mindset toward major powers. The author passionately argues that this deeply ingrained ideological subservience makes mainstream historians psychologically incapable of accepting that an ancient Korean empire ever dominated China. The claim is that they'd rather trust a watered-down, peninsula-bound narrative than embrace records of continental glory. By labeling mainstream historians the modern Samgaksa, the author is making a pretty fierce critique. The original Samgaksa were Joseon dynasty scholars who were intensely loyal to the Ming dynasty of China. The author is arguing that today's historians act exactly like them, basically acting as apologists who blindly accept a China-centric view of history. The author claims these modern scholars deliberately discard any empowering historical texts that show Korean independence and dominance, completely dismissing them as unscientific just because they break the conventional mold. To really drive home the toxic result of this alleged defeatism, the author points out a specific statistic often taught by mainstream scholars, and they do so with a lot of frustration. They note that we are taught Korea has suffered roughly 3,000 foreign invasions throughout its history. I mean, for a history spanning about 2,000 years, that's averaging out to more than one invasion every single year. The source is absolutely appalled by quotes like this one, which are often used to describe traditional Korean history. They argue that teaching such a depressing, victim-centric view just completely destroys national pride. And more importantly, according to the author, it completely ignores Baekje's actual documented continental history, where they were the ones expanding, conquering, and administering foreign territories. And that wraps up our explainer of this source material. We've traced this theory all the way from the ancient maps of the Book of Song detailing Baekje's grip on Yoseo and Jinpyong, to those mysterious blank pages in the Book of Southern Qi, right up to the modern-day accusations of sadaejui against mainstream academia. Ultimately, whether you view this Continental Baekje theory as a brilliant uncovering of a suppressed truth or just a highly contested misinterpretation of ancient texts, it definitely challenges us to think critically. It forces us to ask, who writes history? Who alters it? And how does the history we choose to believe shape our identity today? What do you think? Keep questioning, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.